I like to think that composers and musicians are not in the music business, but are in the magic business.
Oh, I love that. Yes, I agree.
When you have an idea and you put it on the page, and describe that first feeling of when you actually put it in front of human beings.
Well, the process always starts at the piano. I'm not a pianist, but I use it as a tool. So I find a melody or a harmony that really catches my ear. And then I'll go to the computer, to my notation software Finale, and I'll enter that. And I'll be very playful with the material. So I'll, stretch it out, pitch shift it, transpose it, various processes that I did a lot with electroacoustic music, actually, that translate very organically to writing for ensemble and instrumental music. And then I go between the piano and the computer, and I check in on the playback fairly often, and I find that very helpful as a tool to hear the pacing of a piece, the rhythm, the pitch, the harmony, and then imagining the textures. Obviously, they can't really create very extended techniques and so forth, but combining the playback with the imagination. But then you go from this very solitary environment to being with, dozens of musicians if it's an orchestral work, and that juxtaposition is quite striking, and it's very exciting, because even though composing is very solitary, I feel like I'm with a lot of people because I'm imagining specific musicians, so it doesn't feel lonely. But it's thrilling, that first rehearsal, when you first hear a new piece come to life, especially when you're in the hands of like the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Yannick is the dream team, so you're going to get a really great first reading. When I was starting out, sometimes the first readings were a little shaky, to say the least, so that can be very anxiety inducing, but I'm very grateful the caliber of musicians that I'm working with at the moment make that process a lot easier.
Sure. I mean, it helps when you got the best.
Yes.
But I'm curious about earlier in your career, was there ever a moment when playback sounded amazing and then you put the music in front of humans and you're like, oh, wait a minute, like I got to change that?
Definitely. I mean, it's definitely trial by fire. A lot of my musical education has been self-taught. I actually didn't have my first composition teacher until I was in my 20s, which is considered quite late. But a lot of it is, trying things out, hearing what works, what doesn't work. The thing I think myself and a lot of composers are most sensitive to is tempo. So, and MIDI can be very deceiving in that way, because it can play something at 180, but put that in front of human beings, and that's not possible. So I think when I was starting out, the tempos were not always realistic. So I tried to be a bit more, aware of the human limitations with playing and executing music.
Yeah, and electronic music doesn't have that problem. You can have interlocking 30-second notes perfectly for 8 minutes if you wanted to, but asking a human being to do that.
Exactly. And there are things that you need to consider. For example, if you're writing vocal music, you can't, unless a singer has perfect pitch, you can't expect them to pluck a note out of thin air. So you have to have preparatory notes that give them context for that note. So really, really thinking about the human experience of the musicians and the conductor that are bringing the music to life. I try and keep that more in mind now.
Do you have a story about a trial by fire, like a moment where you were like, whoa, I need to give preparatory notes. Whoa, I didn't put a breath in there. Like, was there ever a moment?
I've definitely found that I need to add more space in my writing for woodwinds. My clarinet concerto Weathered and my saxophone concerto Glasslands are pretty intense. It's very physically demanding. There are spaces there, but they're short, and so I'm very grateful. Jess Gillum is playing saxophone and Martin Frost clarinet. They're extraordinary and able to circular breathe too. But
that helps.
That helps. But so that's my big learning thing at the moment is space. I need to put more space in my music.
What's your philosophy on dealing with limitations, and when you approach a new work, how do you set those?
It really helps to find something that's going to give you structure. I have a cello concerto which is in 5-minute movements, and that's framed around a poem by Rumi, and it's a very short poem. Each line begins with the word dance, so it's dance when you're broken open, dance when you've torn the bandage off, dance in the middle of the fighting, dance in your blood, dance when you're perfectly free. So each of those 5 lines becomes the title of each of the 5 movements, and I try and evoke the imagery of each line through the music. So that's a very helpful structural device.
Yeah. So you get this assignment, you win this. Oh, did you apply?
No, it's actually part of the American Composers Earshot program. So they have one of them is the Underwood New Music Readings with the American Composers Orchestra, which I participated in back in 2005, so almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And they pooled together all the women composers that had participated over the decades now of this program, and then the orchestras picked who they would like to work with, and I'm thrilled that the Philadelphia Orchestra invited me to be a part of this program.
Amazing. So they picked you and 6 other women composers to create new works. You get the duration, 6 minutes.
5 to 10.
Okay, 5 to 10.
Or 5 to 7. 5 to 7, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you get the instrumentation, full orchestra. This is your 10th work for full orchestra. You get your limitations, which is instrumentation, duration, and deadline.
Yes.
And what's your deadline? And when do you get it? Like, what's your timeline?
I forget what the timeline was. The pandemic is a sort of vortex of time and has made everything kind of very amorphous in my memory. But I spent a good chunk of time on it. I knew that it was going to be premiered with Mozart's Requiem. So that was it's not always that I'll go to what the piece is programmed with as the inspiration or part of the inspiration, because I know that in subsequent performances it's not going to be paired, obviously, with Mozart's Requiem. But again, I went to writing as my source of inspiration. The title, This Moment, actually comes from a short phrase written in calligraphy by the Vietnamese Buddhist monk and Zen master and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh. And he actually passed away last year at the age of 95. And the quote is, "This moment is full of wonders." And that's why this piece is called This Moment. And then it was also a reaction to the shared collective grief and loss coming out of the pandemic, and then knowing it was going to be paired with Mozart's Requiem this past summer at the Bravo Vail Festival with Yannick and the Philadelphia Orchestra, I turned to that piece. It seemed appropriate to reflect on that. And it reminded me of another quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, that the meditation on death is actually a really important meditation, because in doing so you really cherish life, and that there's lessons to be learned with that. So I'm fascinated by Buddhist philosophy, especially Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings. So that seemed a very fertile point of departure for the music.
Yeah. What's your relationship with Mozart's Requiem, I should ask?
Well, I think I'm really drawn to melody. I should say I didn't grow up in home with classical music. There was a lot of folk, a lot of jazz and music, and I think something that's resonated with me with that music is sense of melody, and it's something that's more and more featured in my music. I embrace it more and more. And I think in Mozart's Requiem there are some melodic lines, both in the vocal writing and also in the instrumental writing, that are incredibly memorable and evocative and powerful. So that has drawn me to that piece, because it just stays in your memory. You know, there's certain pieces of music that you listen to and they just sort of haunt you, and that piece does that for me.
And there are specific lines from Mozart's Requiem that appear in your piece, you were telling me earlier. So let's talk about that. Let's get under the hood a little bit.
There's basically 2/3 quotes. The perhaps most, well, there are 2 very recognizable. One is the fugal subject of the Kyrie, and there's also a counter line in that, an ascending chromatic line in the sopranos. So I use that ascending line to open up the piece, and then I actually use the Kyrie later in the piece as a sort of round, or a canon of sorts. I take the instrumental accompaniment, which is iconic. I think it's probably the most identifiable music, perhaps, of the Mozart's Requiem. So I use that.
Can you play that?
Okay. Oh, wait, no. Very very simple. But in the first iteration, I add a melody to this, so treating it again as an accompaniment. The offbeats become these sustained, sweeping gestures in the strings, and we then have cascades of woodwinds above it. So adding layers with each repetition.
Cool. So let's talk about what's happening instrumentation-wise. So like what we just heard the piano reduction of you kind of sharing what's going on in the orchestration?
Yeah, so it has a long introduction that gets you there, which takes this ascending and descending chromatic line. But then, yes, we arrive about a quarter into the piece with this, the strings are playing the downbeats with these offbeats in a sort of 12/8 lilting feel. And then the trumpet and bassoon have a melody in octave unison. So they're playing the same melody, but an octave apart. And I love playing with that with the orchestras, getting those different colours together. And then as it builds up, I add in the double basses and the cello. So when you first heard it, it was just the upper strings. So it has a richer sound. And then I have these cascades of woodwinds for chromatic runs, starting high and sort of undulating, outlining the contour of this accompaniment figure until the whole orchestra is playing sort of a cacophony of sound, and then it suddenly snaps back to a very reduced instrumentation. And that's something that I often do in my music, is go from one extreme and then zoom it back out from a very different angle.
So that's great. I mean, the brass is like holding out in the beginning of the piece, like kind of drilling this pedal note.
Yeah, they do. There's a massive tam-tam. I wanted it to be dramatic. Mozart's Requiem is dramatic, and this moment of full of wonder, I mean, that piece is bursting at the seams with wonder. The tuba is way down in the low register, doubled up an octave by the bass trombone, which then is also doubled by the timpani doing a roll in unison. So you get this really full, rich sound, and then the contra bassoon and the bassoons in the mix, and the double basses. So you got this really low, like you said, these low pedal tones that support these more sort of weaving harmonies above it.
Yeah. How do you kind of make these orchestration arranging decisions?
They're very intuitive. So as I mentioned earlier, I start with the piano and then I use playback. So I just, often I imagine actually that I'm dancing. I have a pair of wireless headphones at home. And once I have a couple of minutes of music, I'll step away and just sort of imagine that I'm dancing to get a sense of the pacing. And I think, oh, now it needs to change. Something needs to change. And then, or that needs more weight. You know, it's a bit more earthy. But it's very instinctive approach to composition. I very rarely plan. I mean, I plan out that it's got to be 6 minutes, but then I'll just be quite playful and see where the music leads me.
And how does it end?
It ends actually with the same material that opened, but it's transposed up a major third. So the idea of transformation, which is something that's very much at the heart of Buddhist philosophy, the idea that yesterday's tears are tomorrow's rain, that sense of transformation. So I do that often with a piece of music. I'll reprise material from the beginning at the end, because I feel that once you've been through that musical journey, you somehow listen to it differently. And it just sort of dissolves, and perhaps maybe I even write that. No, I don't write that, but I do write 5 seconds of silence at the end. Sometimes I'll do that actually to write it in, to give a bit of space for the music just to really feel the silence.
And then a cell phone goes off.
Exactly. Yes, there's always one.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Anna Clyne, thanks for coming to WRTI.
Thank you for having me.
All right.